Hey guys, Chris here with the Good Old Gamer. So today we're going to have a little bit of fun. We're going to be comparing a budget GPU or an entry-level GPU from here today in 2019 compared to the best and fastest GPUs from 2006, barring the 8800 GTX, which kind of snuck in there at the end. But the 7900 GTX and X1950 XTX from ATI were the last of the DirectX 9 only graphics cards, and they are the most powerful single GPUs that both manufacturers produced. So I wanted to see here today how a lowly video card of only $50, has no power connector, can run at as low as 35 watts, this is an RX 460, would compare. Now the reason why I'm choosing to use the RX 460 over something like the RX 570, which is better price to performance value, it is the better GPU out there, is the fact that the RX 460 is a more versatile GPU. It's much smaller, it runs much cooler, runs quieter, and can fit in more situations. So it's a more versatile card for more people out there. Plus, if you're mostly interested in older games, if you're not really interested in the latest and greatest AAA titles, you just want to play maybe some esports here today and older titles, something like this might be able to still handle that. And that's why I wanted to go ahead and show this to you guys, so you don't even have to invest that extra 40 or 50% in something like an RX 570. But I do want to clarify that the 570 is hands down the best price to performance graphics card on the market, bar none. Nothing else comes close. So let's talk about today's competition. So the X1950 XTX was actually pretty significant. This was the first graphics card to use GDDR4. This is a memory type that wasn't really used in many graphics cards at all throughout history. We kind of jumped right from GDDR3 up to GDDR5 for the most part, but this card does have GDDR4, and that's kind of significant. And then the 7900 GTX, this was the most powerful graphics card from NVIDIA and significantly faster than their previous flagship, the 7800 GTX. Now, both of these cards originally retailed for about $500, and we're going to be comparing that to, like I said, basically a $50 graphics card here today. So let's go ahead and see how these cards all stack up. Alrighty guys, so starting things off with Fear from 2005, this is at 720p, max settings, no soft shadows of course. Anybody who remembers this game knows it doesn't look very good and really does tank performance. So alright, as we can see here, the RX 460 is unsurprisingly much faster than the two cards from 2006. We can see, however, the 7900 GTX and X1950 XTX relatively similar. The X1950 is a decent bit faster, but not worlds apart. However, moving on over to 1080p, we can see that the RX 460, very playable, of course. Even at high refresh, this thing's not a problem at all. But we can definitely see a divide forming between the X1950 XTX and 7900 GTX, which was barely able to play this, and man, was that really difficult to watch for benchmarking. The X1950 actually does fairly well with over 60 FPS average, even at 1080p max settings, so that's very impressive. Now next up, Batman Arkham Asylum from 2009, once again high preset, 2x MSAA. We have the RX 460 miles and miles ahead at 323 FPS on average, with 109 as the 1% low, so that's very good. And then we can see that the 7900 GTX is vastly inferior to that of the X1950 XTX. And it was at this point that I started to think, I'm like, these guys were considered competitors in 2006. This does not look very competitive to me. Kicking things up to 1080p, we can see the RX 460 coming in at 197 FPS on average and 111 on the 1% low. So very playable. And then the 7900 GTX, yeah, once again, this was very painful to benchmark at 16 FPS average. Meanwhile, the X1950 XTX came in at 46 FPS average. This is a huge gap here, and I can't believe that these guys were considered in the same league all the way back when. Next up, Bad Company 2 from 2010. This is the 720p numbers. Once again, high settings, 2x MSAA. And the RX 460 coming in at 195 FPS average and 150 FPS on the 1% low. Obviously in a whole nother league. as neither the X1950 XTX nor 7900 GTX delivered playable performance even at 720p. I guess you could say 30 FPS might be kinda playable, but this is definitely a game that you want at least 60 FPS average, and you definitely want better than 11 frames per second on the 1% low. And because the 7900 GTX couldn't even manage 30 FPS average at 720p, I decided to scrap that in this particular benchmark because I didn't want my eyes to bleed unnecessarily. Nobody wants to run benchmarks in single digits if they can avoid it. Okay, so for the RX 460, we have a 144 FPS average, which is really strong, with 76 FPS on the 1% low. So this is very, very good showing from the RX 460. And then we have the X1950 XTX. I mean, it showed up, but you're definitely not going to be playing this game at 1080p on this card. Moving on over to Deus Ex Human Revolution from 2011, high settings. This one, we did not put on any AA, because I'm not a fan of FXAA. I'd rather have none. So I decided to just turn that off. Okay, so as we can see with the RX 460, very, very good frame rate, 120 FPS average, 72 FPS on the 1% low. And the 7900 GTX, this is not an anomaly here. It was 1 FPS on that 1% low, but with a 13 FPS average, kind of makes sense. The X1950 XTX actually had a 1% low of 13 FPS, so its 1% low matched the average for the 7900 GTX, and then kicked it up to 26 FPS on the average frame rate. Obviously, I wasn't going to waste my time benchmarking these guys at 1080p because neither of them could hit 30 FPS average at 720p. However, the RX 460 does pull in 87 frames per second on average and 75 frames per second on the 1% low. So this is a very good showing for the RX 460. Obviously, Deus Ex, very, very playable on this budget-friendly card. Now, the most important question in the world, can it run Crysis? So I wanted to save this one for last, even though Crysis came out in 2007. We're running DirectX 9, 64-bit also, I didn't put that in there. High settings, 2x MSAA. I actually disabled MSAA for the 7900 GTX because it would not even render properly, and the numbers were so low, I figured I'll just throw them in there because it doesn't really matter. However, taking a look at the RX 460, we are getting 74 frames per second on average, which is pretty solid, and 43 FPS on the 1% low. So this is actually very, very playable. As I just alluded, the 7900 GTX was a complete joke. The X1950 XTX was able to run it. It was slightly better at 16 FPS. It was still a slideshow, but it did get through the benchmark much, much easier than the 7900 GTX. Then, of course, we're going to skip these two for 1080p because that's completely out of the question. But for the RX 460, we do have an average frame rate of 61 FPS and 43 for the 1% low. So even at 1080p, the RX 460 does deliver very playable performance in Crysis. So that answers the question. Yes, a $50 video card here in 2019 can run Crysis. Okay, so averaging up all of the benchmarks in 720p, of course, because, well, these guys couldn't run most games in 1080p, so we just did the 720p average. We have the RX 460 coming in at 218 FPS and 100 FPS on the 1% low. 7900 GTX coming in at 37 FPS and then 14% on the 1% low. And for the X1950 XTX, we're coming in at 56 FPS average, which is pretty good. That's close to the 60 FPS average that you would want. And then on the 1% low coming in at 24 FPS. So that's a little bit low, but you know, if you still have one of these and you want to build an old retro rig and play these games, you could make it work at 720p. Now, looking at these numbers, the RX 460 is clearly in a whole nother league, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But I found very interesting the X1950 XTX and 7900 GTX numbers here. Once again, these were considered competitors. The X1950 was considered faster in 2006. But on average, this is actually coming in at 41% higher than that of the 7900 GTX. And on the 1% low, this is actually coming in at 70% higher than the 7900 GTX. So to me, it's really crazy that people would even consider that these two cards were ever competitors. This is a whole nother league beyond the 7900 GTX. The only game that the 7900 was even relatively close was in Fear. Beyond Fear, Even at 1080p, you could tell that the card is just leagues behind the X1950 XTX. I just wanted to point that out because I found that another bit of interesting information from this benchmark. Alright, so unsurprisingly, the RX 460 is significantly faster than the flagship graphics cards from 2006. Now, like I said, this isn't unsurprising, but it's significantly faster, like way in a whole nother league, like many leagues ahead. And that's the reason why I wanted to do this test. This shows that even entry-level graphics cards today are so much further ahead than the best of the best a few years ago. And considering we tested games ranging from 2005 all the way up to 2011, and this thing had no problem, essentially that lets me know that the RX 460 has the entire previous generation, basically the Xbox 360 and PS3 era, pretty much covered. So if you're looking for a 1080p gaming card that's super cheap, super efficient, super quiet, and you can fit it in many different builds, really small form factors, things of that nature, the RX 460 is looking really strong. And you can pretty much bet that any game pre-2012 shouldn't have any problems. And then I can actually attest that even if you do want to play more modern games, you can, but you will have to tweak settings and basically make it work. Maybe we'll check that out in a future video. However, this card was compared to DirectX 9 class GPUs, so that's nothing crazy. Here in the future, I'd like to compare this with the 8800 GTX, which basically dominated that segment, as well as the Radeon 4890 and GTX 285, which were basically the next DX10 graphics cards. So that's my game plan for the next video. See how this compares to the DirectX 10 generation of graphics cards. Now, I'm really interested to hear your guys' thoughts on this. Do you like seeing how these older graphics cards perform? Like, for example, the X1950 XTX being significantly faster than the 7900 GTX kind of blew me away. I figured it was going to be faster because it was faster back in the day, but it's significantly faster. So there are other takeaways from this type of video that I found interesting, but I want to hear your guys' thoughts on all this in the comments section below. And then once we're done with the RX 460, are there any other budget-friendly entry-level type GPUs that you'd like compared to the flagships of the past? So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that. Would you like to see the RX 570? Maybe something like the GTX 1050 Ti, another very efficient card. You can get them in really small form factors. They're very versatile as well. That's something that we can check out. So let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. And in the next video, we will be talking about the reference Vega 56s now coming in on the secondhand market under $199. That one's going to be very interesting. Obviously, the cooler is something that's going to turn a lot of people off, but there are ways to make things work, and I'll go over that with you guys in the next one. So stay tuned for that. And if you like this video, please hit that like button. Please subscribe. Please share with friends. That really does help me out. And for as little as $1 a month, if you want to help me get this stuff on hand, you can become a patron over on Patreon. We can discuss this stuff in Discord, and I really do appreciate all your guys' support. That's all I have for today, and I will catch you guys in the next video.